that he's neurologically compromised or ill or senile or whatever, that he's not operating the way that he used to. How could this be news to people who've interviewed him before?
Well, I think this is a real opportunity to gather more data and to take an investigative lens and look at this issue of President Biden and his decision to seek re-election. We've got some data points already. We have the debate that you've just referenced, that people were so surprised at his demeanor. And we now have this ABC interview and the full transcript. I think it's a moment where other media organizations who've done interviews with the president over the last couple of years could release the full transcripts from those interviews. I think it makes sense because we'd have broader data points to assess, was this a one-off, as the White House says, or were there indications of decline earlier on? Were they obvious and apparent, or were they subtle and missed? And if they were obvious, why was it that they seemed to end up on the cutting room floor? I think that having this broader data set for an independent review would really inform the public discussion about the president's decision to stay in the race.
And there's a lot of data to look at. I mean, I've known Biden, watched Biden, been around Biden a lot for over 30 years. And I remember my reaction in 2019 when he decided to run once again for president for the fourth time, I think. I thought, that's not the guy I know. I mean, he's just completely different. And then his sister told a friend of mine, actually, we're very upset because he's in cognitive decline. He's got some neurological illness, and we don't want him to run for president. So I immediately said that on Fox News.
So you reported that at the time?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I showed the tape, like, look at this guy, and was attacked, of course, and ignored. So that was 5 years ago. I wasn't shocked by his performance in the debate, especially, but then other journalists were. They seemed to be. Were they pretending, or like what? I don't understand how someone who did an interview with him like 2 years ago wouldn't have been aware that there was something wrong.
Well, I think it's an opportunity to provide this broader data set so there can be this independent review by the public.
What would that data look like?
Well, let's look at what the transcripts show. Do they show someone who is, very consistent, very focused, very deliberate in their answering of questions, or does it show someone who's maybe struggling to stay on track or is lacking
Do we have
focus?
The transcripts?
Well, media outlets who've conducted interviews with the president should have those transcripts. I mean, it's not standard to release video outtakes from an interview, but you could release the transcript. And I say that as someone who released a transcript of my interview with President Trump back in 2020. Releasing a transcript, I think, is about transparency. So you can have a broad overview of the interview. I think it makes sense because there are other headlines in the interview that maybe your news organization is not going to look at per se. Just sort of separately, I think you have a tremendous responsibility when you sit down with the president of the United States, probably the ultimate newsmaker, to ask questions that are of interest to your news organization, but also to others, right? And then finally, I think a transcript allows you to stand behind the edit that you either post online or that you broadcast, right? Because then the public can see the sections of the interview that you condensed or you made edits for clarification.
Right. So I know that I haven't thought about this enough, but I know that in 2015 or 2016, the New York Times editorial board sat down with Trump and they released a full, apparently unedited transcript, which was chaotic. His speaking style tends to be a little discursive.
That's a great word, discursive.
Yeah, it is nonlinear. But that's well known. I think he's much better on camera than he is, in transcripts. But whatever you think of it, that they put that out there. I don't remember in the last 4 years any news organization that interviewed Biden, and there have been some, releasing a transcript of the interview. Do you?
I can't recall. But I haven't gone back and looked at all of them. But
so what would be so I guess what bothers me is that everyone acts like this is a shock. It was not a shock to me. I have no special knowledge. I had some special knowledge, which I revealed immediately, but it was like super obvious every time I saw him, there's something wrong with that guy. How could the journalists be shocked? Well, why don't they just release immediately?
Well, they could. That's what I think makes a lot of sense right now, to do that. That's ultimately up to them. But I think it just goes to transparency. I think it goes to informing the public discussion right now about the president's fitness for office and to seek reelection. And I think it's also about standing behind your work, right? Like, you decided to make edits in the process for clarity, for time, whatever the issue is.
Right.
And so you can really stand behind that. I think that's important.
But so, again, you were in this business for so long, and me too, and at a time, pre-internet, pre-streaming, where you have a very small chunk of time, 3, 5, 6 minutes for the long ones, and then you just can't use the rest. But now, news organizations should just put the whole thing. I mean, that's what we do. This
Right.
interview is not edited in any way. And if, we'll just let viewers decide what they think of Catherine Herridge or me or whatever, right? But so what would be the excuse that, say, NBC or CBS or ABC or Fox or anybody would have to not put the full thing online now?
I mean, I can't speak to what their rationale would be. I just know
Right.
in my case, I felt it was important to release a transcript,
Yeah.
to allow people to see the work, and to also, I mean, it's hard to look at your own transcript because you look at it and you say, oh, that question could have been more focused, or I should have followed up more,
Right.
or I missed that little piece of news. I should have drilled down a little further, or I interrupted there when I really shouldn't have. I mean, it's a really kind of warts and all process that you're looking at, but it's about sort of the raw integrity of the interview. When you make edits in an interview, you do it for clarity. Sometimes you do it because you have to condense things because you only have a certain amount of time on a broadcast. But it's a real fine line and a balancing act. And you don't want, seeking clarity and brevity or condensing it to cross the line into, a cleanup on aisle 7.
Well, that's what it feels like, though. It does feel like, I don't want to be too judgy. I was telling you at breakfast this morning, I edited something out of an interview once with somebody. I can't remember ever doing that before or since, and I would not do that now. But several years ago, someone said something so bizarre in an interview that I didn't want to follow up on it because I don't know, what the hell are you even talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked the editors to take that out just because I didn't think it was relevant to the conversation. It was weird.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever, I did that. I'll say that I did that. But if you're interviewing someone and he seems like bizarre through the whole interview and you find yourself trying to cover that up, then maybe you're a liar.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think?
Well, I think the instinct when you sit down with the president of the United States is, this is your president. You want them to look their best. I mean, I understand that.
Right.
But if there were indicators, and I don't know there were, but if there were indicators that he was in decline or he was really struggling to answer a series of questions, I mean, that's news, right? I mean, that's a news headline.
Well, and the opposite of news is, of course, censorship and deception. So if you're hiding that, then you're committing, a moral crime, but you're also committing an offense against the profession that you chose, whose purpose is to inform the public of what reality is, right? And you're hiding things rather than exposing them. And that's pretty clear violation, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it's an opportunity to build the data set, to better understand what's happened over the last couple of years and, really apply that investigative lens. I find it so hard to take off my investigative reporter hat,
Right.
but that's sort of how I see it right now. I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious to see what those transcripts may reflect.
Well, in 2016, NBC went and back into its archives and found an outtake of Donald Trump saying something vulgar to Billy Bush, the host, about women and grabbing them and all this stuff. And then they leaked it to David Fahrenthold. I think I'm remembering this correctly.
I can't remember that exactly, but it came out publicly.
If I've gotten that wrong, pardon me. But they leaked it to a Washington Post reporter who had been a college friend of an NBC executive. And then it became this huge thing that, almost derailed Trump's campaign. And that's why they did it, of course. So there's precedent for showing us the outtakes.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have an excuse not to show it to the Biden outtakes?
I mean, I can't really speak for them. I'm sorry to sort of be a little evasive
Right.
about that. I just would advocate for it. I think that it's an issue of such import to the country, and it really informs the discussion and the discourse surrounding this issue. And it goes to accountability with the White House. Was it really a bad night, or was there a broader trend that had been developing?
Yeah. I mean, I feel totally qualified to pass judgment on that question.
Over to you.
Well, it's just I knew the guy, and that's not Biden. Like that's not the guy I remember. Who, and I mean this. I never agreed with him, but I'm a shallow person. So is he. So I always kind of liked him because he's Irish guy, throw his arm around you. How you doing, buddy? Rub your chest. Maybe he sniffed me. I don't care. I like sniffing. And that's just not the guy on TV at all. Like at all. I mean, if I was a conspiracy nut, I would think he was a body double because it's that different. So anyway, in your long and varied career working in a bunch of different big media, the biggest media outlets in the country, did you see people's political or social agendas shape news coverage a lot?
The short answer is yes. I think it's difficult for people to step back and do what I like to say I do, which is balls and strikes, right? People have their own personal lens through which they see stories. But I think you have to really park that at the front door when you go to work, because I think that's when you have the most transparent, credible, authentic journalism.
I agree with that. Do you feel like the composition of newsrooms has changed from when you started in the business? It feels like there was a greater, actual diversity of life experience back then, 30 years ago.
Hard to say. I started my career at ABC in London.
Yeah.
And that was an extremely rarefied atmosphere in a lot of ways.
Right.
These were very experienced people. A lot of the correspondents came out of Vietnam.
Yes.
Very, very deep experience. And I was very fortunate to learn in that environment.
This is when Jennings was still a force there.
Jennings had just left London by the time I had arrived. And I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. When you're that young, you have ideas. It looks so exciting to me.
Totally.
And some of the correspondents in the office really took me under their wing and taught me how to write a story by looking at the interviews, the strongest elements of the interview, the sound bites, and then they trained me to really sit down and look at the video and identify the strongest video, and then the natural sound, which really can be such an important technique.
Sound.
That's right. When you're editing a piece together, because it's really like this mosaic, the strongest sound, the best video, and the natural sound. So this was a really rarefied environment. Have I been in a newsroom like that since? I don't think so.
What was the difference? Was it smarter, more serious?
I just felt with that cohort of reporters, it was all about accountability journalism. I mean, to me, if that's part of my DNA, it's.
What does that mean, accountability?
Accountability journalism is when you're curious and you seek the facts, and then you try and figure out where the buck stops, right? And it's not a question of, well, it's this party or that party. It's whatever entity is responsible.
Right.
And accountability journalism is, like they say, speaking truth to power on both sides of the aisle.
To power is the key, though. I mean, accountability doesn't necessarily mean, hassling poor rural whites with diabetes, the weakest, most despised people in our society. It means asking questions about BlackRock and the National Security Council and the people who actually have all the power. It felt to me 30 years ago like that was implied. Like everyone sort of thought that your job was to hold the powerful accountable, not the weakest.
I still feel that way.
I do too.
Yeah.
I do too.
We have that in common.
I do too. Did you see that change?
Boy, I used to say to people that, technology was supposed to really improve our ability to do journalism, but I sometimes felt that the technology's never been better, but the reporting's never been worse.
Interesting.
And I don't know why that is, except...
Is there a connection? I've never thought of it.
I think sometimes what we're missing is that boots on the ground, person-to-person contact in reporting. Years ago, when I did a journalism degree at Columbia, I had this professor, Dick Blood. That was his name. Dick Blood. And he was sort of a legend in New York City newsrooms. And he used to always say to me, detail matters in good reporting. If you go to a crime scene, you want to count how many bullet holes there are in the windshield. So I think there's that kind of on-the-ground, sort of real traditional investigative feel sometimes that's missing in that person-to-person contact.
Yes. Well, I agree with that. I remember going to a murder scene and looking down, there was blood all over my shoes. Mm-hmm. I didn't put that in the story, but I remember thinking, wow, that actually is shoe leather reporting. You get a real sense of things when you can smell them.
When you think back to major events, I was in New York on 9/11, and we were down near the World Trade Center in the days right afterwards. And I saw someone who was collecting ash off the top of the cars. And at that point, we'd realized that all of the abandoned cars in downtown Manhattan belonged to people who had been killed in the towers. And I stopped this woman and I asked her what she was doing. And she said, my sister wasn't the Windows on the World at the top of the World Trade Center. She didn't survive, and I want to have something to bury for my family. So the ash is what I'm collecting. Mm-hmm. And that was the moment that I realized that so much of the ash that was spread around the city was really people and the buildings. And that kind of tactile feel to the reporting is the kind of reporting that really impacts people and stays with them. And I don't know whether it's the technology or whether it's sort of the immediacy of all these deadlines, but the ability to do that is much harder now than it used to be.
Yeah. No, I think that's really smart. And technology gives you the illusion that all the information is on Google or a text away, when actually talking to people makes all the difference. Huh. So one phenomenon that I noticed, or that I actually didn't notice until I was in middle age, but
You're in middle age?
Well, that's what they claim.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I'm way past middle age. I'm not going to live to. I'm not good at math. 110. So I guess I'm in late life now. But there are beat reporters, people who've, covering federal agencies, particularly in Washington, who become captive to those agencies, to their sources, not in a literal sense. They're not held in the basement in chains, but they are sort of puppets of the people they cover. Like, I really noticed that. I'm thinking of one specific person who I'm not going to name, but I would just say a female national security reporter in Washington and I would watch these, stories come out. I'd be like, that's a lie. It's a lie. And you're doing it on behalf of the people who feed you these lies. Mm-hmm. Have you seen a lot of that?
I think that the danger is that people become sort of so friendly with the press offices that work in these big agencies that they find it hard over time to really challenge them.
That was never a problem for you, I noticed. Should say we work together. For people who don't know Catherine Herridge, one thing I've always loved about you, I don't even know who you vote for, and I mean that, but I did notice that a lot of the Flacks didn't like you, so I always thought that was a good sign.
You want to have the ability to really operate outside the ring. I used to say that one of the advantages to doing reporting, as long as I've done it, is that you start to build a network of contacts, so that's really where your stories are coming from.
Right.
And that the public affairs office in a major government entity is really the last stop for you, right? That's where you're trying to get some response. And I really believe in giving these offices ample time to respond. I did a story recently where we engaged with the Department of the Army and the National Guard for 2 weeks. We really gave them time because we wanted to understand their position and what had happened in a particular case. But sometimes the danger is that people become too close. That's why I think it makes sense in some cases to really rotate reporters so that you don't spend so long on a certain beat that you start to lose your contact sort of outside of that circle.
Well, that's exactly, or you become a tool of lies, which some Pentagon reporters have become, I would say, one in particular. But what's the mechanism for pulling that person back and putting that person on another beat, or for fixing that?
Listen, I've never been a manager, but it just seems to me, when I worked overseas, I saw this with some of the British news organizations, that they would rotate people into the United States for a few years and then they would take them back to Britain. So they would be there through an election cycle, let's say, they'd be there long enough to build contacts, and then they would go back overseas and someone else would come in. So you'd have a fresh set of eyes and ears.
Yes.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. It can be a little frustrating for a reporter because on some beats, it takes you a decade or more to really start to build the contacts and the reputation with individuals. But I do think that you have to check yourself. You have to ask yourself, am I really checking it out to the degree that I need to be? As Professor Blood would say, just because your mother says she loves you doesn't mean you should not check it out, right?
That's right. I learned that firsthand.
Yeah. That's a different conversation.
Sorry, no, totally kidding. That's so dark, but it is funny. So if you're paying any attention at all to what's going on in the world, you've probably asked yourself, what would I do, not just for myself, but for the people who love me and I'm responsible for, my family? What would I do if things really went south, either for a short period or a longer period, if there was an emergency? how would I respond? Well, of course, you need food and water. You need security, some way to protect yourself and your loved ones. You probably have taken care of all of that. But one problem you may not have addressed is, what do you do about medicine? If there's a medical problem when there's not readily available medical care, what do you do for your family? And that's a tough question to answer, actually. But now there is an answer, and it comes from Jace Medical. It is a personalized emergency supply of medicines you might need, antibiotics, other life-saving medicines, to treat a long list of problems you could have: bacterial illnesses, respiratory infections, skin infections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Things that could come up and happen when you can't just drive over to the doctor. This is preparation, and for its cost, probably well worth it. But find out for yourself. Go to jacemedical.com to get emergency stock of common medicines for yourself and your family. It'll all be reviewed by a board-certified physician and dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. Not crackpot stuff. It's essential. I have it. You should too. Use the promo code Tucker at checkout for an extra discount, but don't wait until you need it. It's worth doing now. jacemedical.com. I wonder, since you spent, you're at ABC, Fox News, CBS, you just left CBS pretty recently, the spring maybe?
February.
February, okay. Mm-hmm. Like you spent your whole life and I have too, at these huge news organizations. And toward the end, independent journalism, digital journalism is on the rise. Like, what was the view of that from inside the big news organization?
Well, I think within big corporate media, there was still a sense that they were sort of the final word on things.
Really?
Yeah, or maybe it's not the best phrase, gatekeepers. For information. But after I lost my job in February, I took a couple of months to really educate myself about the marketplace. And I was surprised at how much the media landscape had really changed.
Isn't that crazy that you wouldn't know that? I didn't know it either. I mean, I'm not criticizing you. I mean, but isn't it weird that you can work, I'm in the news business, but you really don't know what the news business is?
I think you're very focused on what you're doing day to day, and you're not sort of looking at the bigger picture. But I took some time to try and understand how the landscape had really shifted. And I was surprised at how much it had really evolved in the 4.5 years that I was at CBS News. And I say this as someone who spent my entire career working with big corporations. And I was grateful for those jobs. I don't want to minimize that. But what I see now is that those entities are really shrinking and contracting, and the audiences are getting older. And the real explosive growth is with smaller independent operations and smaller independent newsrooms.
Why do you think that is, though? I mean, if you're someone like Matt Taibbi, who also worked, for Rolling Stone, worked for a big company, and then went out completely on his own. He has a Substack, and then he creates his own news organization, but it's just one guy. Mm-hmm. And if you look at his growth and revenue, it's so much higher than like people with the backing of these huge corporations. Like, how could Matt Taibbi get a bigger audience than Norah O'Donnell or whoever's hosting these shows? I don't even know who's hosting them anymore, but like, how did that happen?
I think the public is really hungry for credible, reliable information. I don't think it's more complicated.
I agree with you
than that. And I'm not here to sort of take shots at my old employers, but I just, that's what I came away from.
But what's so interesting is like, if you're, General Motors and you have a sort of monopoly on your area, and all of a sudden some guy starts building cars in his garage and like, they're more popular than you, mm-hmm. It's kind of an indictment of you, isn't it?
I think the speed at which things have evolved has really surprised people. I mean, when you start to look at I think we're at an inflection point.
For sure.
You start to look at the numbers. For example, you did some interviews that related to the Biden investigation. Yeah. And these were, 90 million views or, sometimes higher, but these are big numbers. And when you compare that to what an evening news broadcast is, 4 million, 7 million, 6 million, I mean, you're just reaching a broader, larger global audience.
Yes.
And I would argue, and I don't have the benefit of all the data, but it's also a younger audience. And it may be an audience that's really engaged in gathering information, because if they're on these platforms, they're checking multiple times a day for headlines, for new video, for new content. So these are real voracious consumers of information.
I think that's all absolutely true, but it leaves unanswered the question, how did this happen? How did, penniless upstarts beat, the entrenched monopolies? And I just know in my own life, the only moments of growth that have ever occurred for me, the pivot points in my life have all been those moments where I'm like, wow, I really suck. Like I really made bad decisions. No, for real. I drink too much, or I got caught lying, or I'm just kind of a rotten person. I have to change. And I got fired once for basically I was just lazy and not taking my job seriously. I stopped being lazy. I started taking my job seriously. It's like really important to realize how much you suck.
Well, there's a forcing function.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Long-winded question. Do you see that process playing out in corporate media?
I can speak for myself right now.
Yeah.
I lost my job in February.
You just lost it? Like you forgot where you put it?
No, I didn't actually lose my job. I
had a few drinks and lost my job along with my car keys and my cell phone.
Looking around for it. My job was terminated. That was a very public thing.
I know. I'm not making. I was fired too.
I lost my company health insurance. That was a very big deal for us because we have a son who's a transplant patient. He's a chronic medical condition. And then I had my records seized by my employer, which was a red line I thought should never have been crossed. And then I was held in contempt of court. So February was a very, very big month for me. But I made a decision once I'd educated myself about the marketplace, which I would never have done if there hadn't been that forcing function, that for now I was going to go independent. I'd had some generous opportunities to sort of go back to a large corporate media outlet. But I decided that I would go independent and I would tell the stories that I couldn't tell before, because I was at a point in my career where I had built up a network of contacts and I felt now is the time. If it's not now, then when?
Amen. I couldn't agree more. So since you brought up, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make fun. I know it is traumatic to have your life turned upside down in a day. I just think you're going to be so much happier. But let's talk about that. Like, so you get hired, you were at Fox News where we worked together and I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
I enjoyed it too.
I thought you were really honest.
You're very well behaved.
Honest.
I felt like I was a good moderating influence when we sat down together.
I loved it. But then you left and went to CBS News, which is a huge channel with a storied past, in decline. This is my assessment, because they weren't doing what they're supposed to do, which is like tell you interesting stuff that you didn't know and be honest and brave. You are honest and brave, and you specialize in interesting stories. So I thought, wow, this is great. I mean, CBS is a little smarter than I thought they were. And you did break a bunch of stories, and you were the most memorable person on their air, the one doing the fiercest journalism. This is, again, my assessment. And then they have cutbacks because their business is failing, and they fire you. I'm like, wait, what? Did you see that coming?
I didn't see it coming.
Yeah, I didn't.
It wasn't a performance issue. I am so proud of the work that we did there, especially the work with veterans. I mean, we really helped be a catalyst for legislation that impacted 1 million veterans and civilians for the better.
Yes.
I mean, I feel very proud of that. But that's their choice, whether I work there or not. It's not my company.
Of course.
But the seizing of the records was a terrible red line that was crossed.
If you don't mind, I know this has been written about, but I just want to get a record on video of what exactly happened. So how did this unfold? Like, what kind of warning did you have, and what happened?
Well, I testified to Congress about this as well. I was laid off on a Zoom call. I was told my job was terminated. And
did they explain why?
No, not beyond saying that they were making cuts. And I was locked out of my email and locked out of the office. And a couple of days later, a courier came to the house with just a couple of boxes of clothing and some books and a few awards. And I said, where are all my investigative files and my research and my reporting notes? And she said, you're just going to have to talk to Human Resources about that. And I got the union involved, SAG, AFTRA. I'm not going to go into all the details, but there was a very vigorous back and forth about returning the records.
What were the records, like interview notes? And
What I would say is that there were interview notes, research, reporter notes, contact information. And when I had left other major organizations, ABC and Fox, it was completely different. There was an understanding that you would go through your materials, you would take with you what was essentially your reporting materials, and you would leave what belonged to the company. And I knew from people at CBS that what was happening to me was not standard. One person in particular said that when their office was cleaned out, they put in dirty coffee cups and Post-it notes. I mean, everything came back to them.
yeah.
I think if the union hadn't gotten involved and there hadn't been a public outcry, I would never have seen those records again. The union really stood up for journalism. And I testified that when the network of Walter Cronkite seizes your reporting information, including confidential source information, it's an attack on investigative journalism. And I heard from contacts that I've worked with over the years who've helped me to expose government wrongdoing and corruption, that they were very concerned that they would be identified.
So again, I doubt you will agree with this. I don't know what you really think, but from my perspective, super obvious they're taking you out before the election because you're reporting on Hunter Biden's laptop. And that's my take on it. I was shocked that they fired you. Then when I reflected for a moment, I was not shocked at all. They took out the Drudge Report before the 2020 election. They, whatever. Lots of people who are in the way have been taken out before elections. So, do you think your notes were, did they go through your notes during the time they had them?
I really can't answer that.
Because you don't know, or?
I just don't want to really answer that.
Yeah. Okay.
Right
well,
now,
I think
that's
people
okay.
can. No, of course. I think people can draw their own conclusions. Tell us about the reporting you did.
Publicly they said they haven't, but anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. It will be kind of tempting to go through your interview notes. I'd like to. But, why would they seize your personal reporting product?
It was a very sad episode for me, just professionally and personally, because I thought that we had done some really tremendous work on not only the laptop, but also the IRS whistleblowers. This was a major story for CBS News. I did an interview along with one of my colleagues, and I think that really changed the public discussion of the Hunter Biden investigation and this question of whether there was a double standard applied in that case.
If you wouldn't, for those of us who missed the CBS report, tell us what the tax investigation into Hunter Biden. So Hunter Biden, in the end, got convicted of a completely ridiculous gun. This is my personal editorializing, but a ridiculous gun charge. Like, who cares, actually? But there are other potential crimes. Tell us about the tax
Well,
situation.
I would think about the Hunter Biden case as having two buckets. The first was the gun charges, and then the second is this tax case. I've always felt the tax case is a much more serious case,
yes, of
and
course,
has the greatest legal jeopardy for himself and members of his family. I'd encourage people just to look at the indictment, which is in California, and it's my memory is that it's on the first page or the second page. They refer to him as a lobbyist. And that, to me, is an indicator that the special counsel is exploring whether there were violations of FARA, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And that, in simple terms, means that if you're working on behalf of the interests of a foreign government, you need to be clear with the U.S. government.
You have to register.
That's right. And seated throughout that document is information about his businesses with Ukraine, with China, with others. So to me, it leaves the door open to a superseding indictment. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it certainly, to me, was an indicator or a flag that was possible.
So, but the tax charges specifically, what do they amount to?
These are felony tax charges. They're pretty significant. And a tax case, the challenge for any defendant is that these are paper-driven cases. They're not really witness-driven cases. What did you attest to when you signed the forms? What did your accountant attest to? And I think one of the important elements in the case is how much of this happened after he was sober, right? Because there's a whole window with the taxes where he's really a heavy user and drug addict. But as he told the Delaware court last year, when the plea deal fell apart, there was a period of time where he became clean. So how many of these alleged bad acts happened during that period versus when he was an addict?
And that's relevant because sober people have no excuse.
Well, it just goes to your state of mind, right? I think a jury.
These weren't mistakes.
Yeah, I think any jury wants to understand someone who's come through addiction. They want to understand that they're sympathetic to that because that's like a daily challenge for individuals. And I think that knowing when they were able to get themselves clean, I think helps inform their view on the evidence and what actions.
I think that's right. So, what's the status of those charges?
I haven't been following it as closely, but in the fall, I think that goes to trial.
It was just kind of interesting. I mean, this is relevant now, and I don't think it's often referred to in daily reporting on what Joe Biden is going through right now. Mm-hmm. So 10 days ago-ish, there was the debate. People were shocked. Democratic donors appear shocked. I talked to one of them who really was shocked, didn't know that Biden was impaired. And there was a push, pretty sizable push from members of Congress for Biden to step aside. And he's now issued this letter, which seems to me was written by his son, Hunter, saying, I'm staying in. And Hunter, it's been reported widely, is in the White House. He's his father's chief advisor on this. And you're sort of wondering, like, what is this? And you're saying, well, Hunter Biden is facing this trial.
Yeah.
It's probably better to have your dad be president when you go to